Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. I'm Brad Wilson, Executive Director of the James Madison Program here at Princeton University. Today, we're concluding 3 days of lectures on the topic Pagans and Christians in the City, the Spiritual Sources of Civic Struggle. These are the Charles E. Test, M.D. Distinguished Lectures. This year being given by Stephen Smith, Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego. As we've mentioned over the last 2 days, Professor Smith is the author of several books, including The Rise and Decline of American Religious Freedom with Harvard University Press, The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse with Harvard, Getting Over Equality, A Critical Diagnosis of Religious Freedom in America with NYU, and Foreordained Failure, The Quest for a Constitutional Principle of Religious Freedom with Oxford University Press. His lectures over these days are a work in progress for his next book, which will be on pagans and Christians in the city. Today, his lecture will be Coming Home, ? The Imminent, Immanent City. Please welcome Steve Smith.
Thanks, Ray. I'm impressed and appreciative that so many of you have come out for this last lecture. I think it's both probably a Christian and a pagan virtue to endure to the end. And for Christian laborers, even if you show up, I think, at the end of the day and work the last couple of hours, you get the full blessings and so forth. So I hope there'll be some reward for those of you who have come out this afternoon. In the previous lecture, I suggested that the culture wars, and more specifically conflicts over public symbols, legally recognized norms of sexuality, and religious freedom, can be understood as a sustained effort to re-engage the 4th century struggle and to reverse the religious revolution by which Christianity displaced ancient paganism in the Roman Empire. The culture wars amount to a counterrevolution, or to a campaign to retake the city for imminent religiosity, or for modern paganism, as T.S. Eliot put it. Whether that campaign will succeed remains uncertain, I think. Occasionally a critic or combatant will pronounce the conflict over, with the imminent or progressive side triumphant. In this spirit, about a year ago, Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet declared victory for the Progressive Party. The culture wars are over, they lost, we won. Tushnet's declaration seemed ungracious, but not implausible. At the time, the momentum seemed all on the side of imminent progressivism, and maybe it still does. Still, I think it's worth remembering that a little over a decade ago, after the re-election of George W. Bush, observers were sometimes rendering the opposite verdict, sometimes in despairing tones. And just what the unexpected electoral victory of Donald Trump may presage in these matters is at this point anyone's guess. Lacking any Isaiah or Tiresias to call upon, I think we would be wise to forego confident predictions. But still, let's suppose that Tushnet is right and that the recent trajectory holds so that modern paganism manages to grow in strength and to consolidate its hold on the city. Would this development be one to celebrate or to lament? That's the question I want to think about in this final lecture. So this lecture will be a little bit more explicitly concerned with some of the normative questions. The first 2 lectures were designed more to show how thinking about our contemporary situation in terms of Eliot's thesis and in terms of an opposition between paganism or imminent religiosity and transcendent religiosity or Christianity can shed light on a lot of our current cultural conflicts. I wasn't intending to advocate particular normative resolutions to any of those conflicts. In the questions and answers, some of you have, I think, tried to bring me out on, what the normative implications would be, and I fumbled around with those questions and so forth. I certainly have views on them. As I mentioned, I'll write amicus briefs in a case from time to time and so forth. But that wasn't the primary purpose of those lectures. This lecture, on the other hand, is intended to reflect a little bit more in a general way on the sort of normative question. Would the triumph of the pagan city be a good thing or not? Writing in the mid-20th century, the novelist Walker Percy remarked on, quote, Western man's sense of homelessness and loss of community. Percy discerned in contemporary man a, quote, sense of homelessness in the midst of the very world which he, more than the men of any other time, has made over for his own happiness. This homelessness might be diagnosed as a product of the developments that we considered in the first lecture. Christianity left human beings as resident aliens, as the letter to Diognetus put it, no longer fully at home in the world. Later, the disenchantment of the world described by Max Weber and associated with modern secularism may seem to have completed this process of alienation, leaving human beings isolated strangers, stranded in a forbidding and purposeless world. As I noted in the first lecture, this bereft condition has been described and lamented, or perhaps reveled in, by thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who urged that in a meaningless world we must proceed, quote, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. But the revival of imminent religiosity, as in Dworkin's last book, purports to offer a remedy for this condition, assuring us that sacredness, sublimity, and meaning are real after all the more real, actually, because they're no longer sloughed off onto an unattainable transcendent source or future state. Rather, these qualities are intrinsic to this world and to this city. So the imminent religiosity of modern paganism promises to reconsecrate the world, this life, and this city in a way that hasn't been possible since the Christian Revolution. Looked at one way, in short, the revival of imminent religion and the restoration of the pagan city amount to an invitation to come home, to come back to the home we were driven out of by the Christian Revolution. Indeed, it may seem that the fully realized modern pagan city would in fact be a big improvement over the ancient one. The renowned historian Edward Gibbon was able to imagine 2nd century Rome as a golden age and as the most enviable period in human history, but only by studiously neglecting to dwell on the vast slave populations, the ubiquitous brothels staffed by desperate and downtrodden women, the savagery of the gladiatorial games, and the widespread practice of infanticide. In our own times, by contrast, the pagan city would be one that has renounced slavery, has declared an equality of men and women, and has even forbidden bullying and microaggressions. And spectacular advances in economic productivity and technology and medicine afford modern citizens a level of flourishing unimaginable to their distant predecessors. Eliminate the alienation and divisiveness and sense of sin that Christianity introduced, and our bliss would be complete, or so it may seem. And yet T.S. Eliot, whose thesis I've been sympathetically exploring in these lectures, took a different view. Eliot favored a city based on a renewed Christian vision, but he recognized that most of his audience would find that vision prima facie unappealing, or worse. People would only come around to the Christian view, Eliot thought, if they would seriously contemplate, what the alternative of modern paganism would actually entail. In this lecture, I want to pursue Eliot's suggestion by asking two questions. First, does modern paganism have the resources to support genuine community? Second, if we suppose that it does, perhaps bracketing our doubts, would the modern pagan city be one that would respond to the human condition and human needs? Would it be the home that we've been yearning for? Start with the question of community. The pagan city of antiquity enjoyed a fraternal solidarity that the city hasn't enjoyed since the emergence of Christianity, or at least so modern admirers of the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome have supposed. Now, this may seem a hopelessly naive idealization, to be sure. Do we have any reason to believe that lower-class plebeians, or subordinated women, or the vast host of slaves, Spartacus and his brothers, for example, whose crucified bodies were left hanging on crosses for miles along the road to Rome as a sort of teachable moment, felt any civic solidarity with the aristocratic males whose lives of opulence they supported? Still, the ancient city was unified, at least in the sense that most of its subjects could be counted on to give whatever civic allegiance they felt to the city, the earthly city, unqualified by loyalties or commitments to some other transcendent sovereign. Moreover, among themselves, the various polytheistic cults enjoyed a kind of mutual acceptance and respect, or at least once again its modern admirers like Gibbon have supposed as much. Conversely, Judaism and Christianity worked to subvert this unity and respect. And so both political philosophy and constitutional jurisprudence over the last few decades have exhibited a desire to overcome the divisions introduced by Christianity and to recover in modern form the civic solidarity of antiquity. Rather than attempt any general survey, for this afternoon, let's just notice this aspiration in one progressive thinker, one widely regarded as the most influential political philosopher of our times. John Rawls seems to some a secular and individualistic theorist who attempted to screen religious beliefs out of political deliberation and who was criticized by more communitarian thinkers like Michael Sandel. But both descriptions, secular and individualistic, underestimate the complexity of Rawls's thought. Joshua Cohen and Thomas Nagel report that, quote, those who have studied Rawls's work, and even more those who knew him personally, are aware of a deeply religious temperament that informed his life and writings. At one point, Rawls had seriously considered entering a seminary to study for the Episcopal priesthood. His religious and communal inclinations were manifest in his senior thesis, written as a precocious Princeton undergraduate, entitled A Brief Inquiry into the Meaning of Sin and Faith, an Interpretation Based on the Concept of Community. The thesis adopted as a fundamental presupposition, as he put it, the idea that, quote, there is a being whom Christians call God and who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. Man is dependent on God, the young Rawls affirmed, and everything is a gift of God. This theistic presupposition had communal implications. Quote, the universe is a community of creator and created. And this communal dimension needed emphasis, Rawls thought. Quote, the flavor of the times seems to point to a revival of communal thinking after centuries of individualism. Robert Adams remarks that clearly there is nothing that Rawls commends more highly in the thesis than community. As it happened, Rawls entered the military, not the priesthood, and his Christian faith dissipated when confronted with the carnage and terror of World War II. But his commitment to community persisted, and the religious dimension of his thought lingered on as well, albeit in a less overt form. The fundamental goal of Rawls's theorizing, as is true of liberal political philosophy generally, was to envision how citizens of different views and values can live together peacefully and in accordance with their various conceptions of the good life. Rawls, however, was unwilling to rest content with any mere modus vivendi. His ambition, rather, was to articulate the basis for a more genuinely united community, a community bound together not merely by negotiated mutual self-interest, but by commonly shared principles of justice and by a public discourse in which all could participate on equal terms. But how to achieve this unity in the face of de facto differences in the citizens' fundamental moral and religious views? The ancient city was able to maintain the unity Rawls sought because the various polytheistic cults were already inclined to take a relaxed attitude toward truth, and to cheerfully suppose that their diverse deities were probably just the same set of gods going under different names, or at least were members of a common pantheon. So, bracketing the vexing cases of Judaism and Christianity, religious fraternity came naturally, so to speak. The overlapping consensus that Rawls sought was a cultural fact, not a philosophical artifice or a legal prescription. In the modern Christian or post-Christian world, by contrast, that kind of natural unity is no longer available. So how is genuine community to be achieved? And how is the disruptive force of truth, uppercase truth, about which humans can never seem to agree, to be tamed? Rawls's answer, and that of other like-minded liberal theorists, was basically to distance the political community from divisive truth by constructing a civic sphere from which transcendent religion and other potentially disruptive comprehensive doctrines would be screened out. Citizens might retain their religious or philosophical convictions, but within the civic sphere, they would put aside these rival comprehensive doctrines and would deliberate respectfully under the canopy of a shared public reason. That at least was the basic strategy, although over the years Rawls was forced to qualify it in various ways. Through this strategy, the unity and community that came naturally to the ancient pagan city would be reestablished artificially, so to speak, by constructing walls around the civic sphere and keeping Christianity and other strong faiths and philosophies outside those walls. It's a noble aspiration, I think, but how has the project fared? It's frequently observed that public discourse today seems both more shallow and more bitterly contentious than in times past. And upon reflection, these disappointing results shouldn't be surprising. If notions of public reason can't be held solely responsible for our condition, they have likely contributed to it, I think. After all, people whose deepest convictions have been declared inadmissible will understandably feel excluded from public deliberations and alienated from the city governed by such deliberations. In addition, as basic beliefs and commitments are screened out of public decision-making, there's less and less discursive and rhetorical material to work with as people attempt to reason together and to persuade each other. Sometimes, often probably, purely utilitarian or pragmatic desiderata will govern, and people will be able to argue about those, about whether tax hikes or tax cuts will better stimulate the economy, for example. But with regard to the most basic human concerns, affecting life and death, for example, or sexuality or marriage, what are people supposed to say when their fundamental convictions have been ruled out of bounds in advance in the debate? It can happen, indeed it increasingly does happen, that the main or only rhetorical resources that remain will appeal to the one thing that everyone still can agree on, or on which there is an overlapping consensus, namely that it's bad or wrong to act from hatred, bigotry, or a mere desire to harm. Consequently, public debate on all manner of fundamental issues increasingly degenerates into classic accusations of hatred or bigotry delivered with a well-honed righteous indignation. In this respect, both the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission have recently set a depressing example. And thus the aspiration to construct a community grounded in and guided by an elevated and mutually respectful discourse governed by public reason leads instead to a shrill and shallow cacophony in which opposing parties can do little other than accuse each other of being racists, sexists, homophobes, and bigots. More generally, one need not be a Burkean to understand that genuine human communities are not decreed into existence, either by philosophical prescription or by legislative or judicial fiat. They're a product of people living together over time under traditions and customs that are shared or at least acquiesced in. The paganism that consecrated the ancient city was traditional in just this sense. It reflected patterns of living and thinking that had evolved over centuries. Conversely, Christianity was at that time the new, defiant upstart. So perhaps the most powerful pagan indictment of Christianity was that the new religion was subverting the customs on which the Roman city was founded. The criticism was expressed in the pagan senator Symmachus's effort to preserve the shrine known as the Altar of Victory. "Allow us," he pleaded, "we beseech you as old men, to leave to posterity what we received as boys. The love of custom is great." Today, these relations are flipped. Now it's Christianity that has provided the dominant ideal for centuries and has served to support ways of life that by now have come to claim the character of tradition. Conversely, modern paganism has had to assert itself in opposition to received customs and traditions now associated with Christianity, and hence has of necessity been critical and adversarial in character, not traditional. Thus, a central characteristic of the, quote, modern paganism that historian Peter Gay discerned and celebrated in the Enlightenment was its anti-traditionalism and its relentlessly, aggressively critical quality. Modern paganism can hardly be blamed exactly for opposing tradition. Under the circumstances, what else could it do? Still, this critical, anti-traditional, ascetic posture subverts rather than sustains the social material with which actual communities are built and maintained. Sometimes proponents of the modern de-Christianized city at least implicitly understand the importance of tradition and attempt to connect their vision and agenda to the transcendently oriented traditions that have undergirded the nation, at least until recently. But such efforts can end up underscoring the gaping disjunction between the contemporary imminent vision and the received tradition. In this spirit, John Rawls attempted to explain how public reason could make allowance for Lincoln's majestic second inaugural address, perhaps the most profound statement ever made by an American official or politician. This was no easy task, because, as I've noted, Rawls's public reason basically attempts to screen out theological appeals, while Lincoln's speech was pervasively theological in character. Indeed, the speech was, as one historian observed, a theological classic containing within its 25 sentences 14 references to God, many scriptural allusions, and 4 direct quotations from the Bible. Rawls nonetheless suggested 2 reasons why the speech might escape censorship under his theology-averse public reason. But Rawls's first suggestion, that the speech had, quote, no implications bearing on constitutional essentials or matters of basic justice, seems almost comically implausible. Slavery wasn't a matter of basic justice. The reconstitution of the Republic after secession and Civil War wasn't concerned with constitutional essentials. Rawls' second suggestion, that Lincoln's message, quote, could surely be supported firmly by the values of public reason, seems maybe barely plausible, but also a bit tone-deaf. True, a president more attuned to Rawls's prescription could give a talk saying something like, my fellow citizens, slavery was a bad thing and a violation of equal respect. But there's no use pointing fingers now. We need to let bygones be bygones and get on with life. But this bland, theologically sanitized speech would not even come close to approximating the power and insight of Lincoln's actual address. In the end, Rawls' effort to explain why his own civic vision would not exclude the most powerful interpretation of the American experience ever given by a political leader merely reveals the chasm between the contemporary progressive conception of the community and the traditions that in fact have formed, shaped, and supported that community. In some, modern paganism may yearn for a community, but it's been forced to take an adversarial stance toward the actual substance of the community against which it has had to assert itself. Aspiring to reestablish the solidarity of the ancient city, modern paganism has in fact been subversive of the community or communities that actually exist, hence the oft observed growing polarization in American society. Excuse me. Let's look at the question from a different angle. Central to the possibility of community under conditions of pluralism is the practice of tolerance. The ancient Roman city was able to maintain solidarity and diversity because of its universal spirit of toleration, as Edward Gibbon affectionately and wishfully put it. Actually, Roman authorities didn't explicitly endorse the idea of tolerance. Theirs was, quote, not tolerance born of principle, as historian J.A. North observes. It consisted rather of indifference to most of the religious diversity that flourished in the empire, together with an ability to absorb or annex most of the religious cults into the pagan framework. When a religion resisted absorption, as Christianity and Judaism did, Roman authorities could be brutally and unapologetically repressive. Still, whether we describe its attitude as tolerance or as one of indifference/assimilation, ancient paganism did manage to embrace a vast diversity of different cults and deities. Advancing beyond their ancient predecessors, modern progressives tend to talk explicitly and favorably about toleration. Indeed, tolerance is almost the essence of their self-understanding. Conversely, to the progressive mind, intolerance or bigotry seem to be the cardinal sins, as they were not to the Romans. Their more self-conscious embrace of the principle of tolerance might suggest that modern progressives would be even more tolerant than their pagan forebears were. Paradoxically and sadly, this turns out to be a situation in which open endorsement of a virtue, in fact, works to undermine that virtue. How so? Well, if tolerance is a virtue, then intolerance is a vice. And the more emphatically one insists on tolerance, the more censorious one is likely to be toward the vice of intolerance. The observation leads to a familiar question or conundrum. How should a tolerant person or a tolerant society treat people who are intolerant? Probably there's no logically inevitable answer to this question. One possibility is that even the intolerant should be tolerated. In this vein, Justice Holmes countered the argument that Marxists were undeserving of the freedom of speech that their own philosophy rejected, with the observation that, quote, if in the long run the beliefs expressed in proletarian dictatorship are destined to be accepted by the dominant forces of the community, the only meaning of free speech is that they should be given their chance and have their way. But Holmes's interpretation was not the only possible meaning of free speech. Others have argued that those who oppose free speech forfeit their right to it. More generally, the very notion of toleration implies that although much that is disagreeable should be put up with, there may be practices or ideas that are intolerable or beyond the scope of what should be tolerated. On either logical or prudential grounds, one might conclude that one thing that even a tolerant society should not tolerate is intolerance. In this way, enthusiastic endorsement of tolerance can provide a powerful rationale for marginalizing or demonizing people or institutions whose views are deemed intolerant. The notion of intolerance is in turn so elastic that it can cover virtually anyone whose views or commitments imply rejection of beliefs or ways of life to which others adhere. You believe my way of life is immoral, you're being intolerant. Another familiar paradox lurks here, of course. Isn't the condemnation of beliefs or practices deemed intolerant itself a rejection of beliefs or practices to which others adhere, and hence itself intolerant? And at this point, there's a real risk that the whole thing will crumble and that a commitment to tolerance will dissolve into the proposition that we should respectfully put up with a whole diversity of beliefs and practices, except for those that fundamentally disagree with our own. But in practice, it seems this paradox can easily be overlooked, especially by those who have started off by defining themselves as tolerant. And hence, ironically, a professed commitment to tolerance can supply a justification for the massive marginalization of people whose beliefs and practices disagree with those of the proudly tolerant elite. As we speak, I think this logic of intolerant tolerance is at work in epidemic proportions. As I've already noted, the logic informs large swaths of public discourse as advocates accuse and seek to marginalize their adversaries for ostensible bigotry or intolerance. Judges invoke the idea of tolerance without any apparent sense of irony as a justification for imposing heavy sanctions on the photographer or florist or baker who merely wants to be allowed not to celebrate a same-sex wedding to which he is religiously opposed. An otherwise exemplary fire chief is discharged from his job for self-publishing a Sunday school manual containing a section teaching traditional biblical sexual morality, which of course is deemed intolerant. Legislators advocate cutting off state funding for religious universities that don't accept the prevailing tolerant orthodoxy supporting same-sex marriage. Instances proliferated at an accelerating rate. To be clear, I'm not saying that the de-Christianized city could not practice toleration. During the centuries in which Christianity still dominated the civic understanding, at least as a sort of residual ideal, dissenters like John Stuart Mill expounded attractive visions of a more open society, committed to a more principled and expansive tolerance than what prevailed in their own day or in ancient Rome. This more classically liberal vision contemplates a robust community of tough-minded citizens who don't bracket their commitments to truth, who understand that other citizens have different and sometimes incompatible views, and who are prepared to resist complaints of dignitary injury and to encounter and respond to strong condemnations of their own views and ways of life, sometimes by changing them in response to persuasive criticisms. Public discourse in such a community would be, as the Supreme Court once explained, uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Tough-minded, self-confident citizens would accept, perhaps even appreciate, what Andrew Koppelman only partly, I think, sardonically describes as the joys of mutual contempt. Surely there are still citizens and theorists who cling to that more liberal vision of a confident pluralism, as John Inazu describes it in a recent book. So it's imaginable that Christianity and other strong and transcendent religiosities could be accommodated even in a pagan community, in a classically liberal as opposed to eminently progressive pagan community. Still, a triumphalist paganism may see no reason to extend such accommodation to citizens whose views and values disrupt the imminent religiosity on which the pagan city is built. Recall Professor Tushnetz's declaration noted earlier, "They lost, we won." Tushnet goes on to advocate a hardline approach to the defeated religionists. "You lost, live with it," he says. Tushnet's recommendation raises a prudential question. Could a hardline approach succeed in realizing the genuine community to which the pagan city aspires? At present, our public discourse is shrill, nasty, and shallow, as observers on all sides of the cultural divisions often complain. But perhaps that's because the cultural conflict is still active. Civility rarely flourishes in wartime. But if the party of imminence were to prevail decisively, and then were to consolidate its control through hardline measures as contemplated by Tushnet and others, perhaps a genuine, peaceful, respectful community could be achieved after all. Maybe. That's no doubt the progressive aspiration. But here, an observation of Edward Gibbon may be pertinent. As I noted in the first lecture, some historians have surmised that if the 4th century pagan emperor Julian could have reigned for a longer period, paganism might have been reestablished and Christianity gradually eliminated. Gibbon disagreed. By the mid-4th century, Christians still may not have represented a majority of Roman citizens. Even so, Gibbon said, quote, "If we seriously reflect on the strength and spirit of the church, we shall be convinced that before the emperor could have extinguished the religion of Christ, he must have involved his country in the horrors of a civil war." Proposals today aren't for extinguishing the religion of Christ exactly, but rather for excluding it from an ever-expanding public sphere, one now construed to include political deliberation, as per Rawls, and the economic marketplace, as per the proliferating lawsuits against Christian florists and photographers and bakers, and relegating the committed practitioners to a shrinking domain outside the city walls. But a similar prudential question is presented, and a similar, if somewhat scaled-down prediction seems plausible. Plausible, I think, not certain. As we discussed in the first lecture, surveys showing that a vast majority of Americans are still Christian are for these purposes largely unreliable, I think. Many people who mark the box for Christian or Methodist or Catholic may be profoundly uncommitted to or altogether ignorant of their ostensible faiths. The ranks of self-professing Christians are likely pervaded by people who are realistically more pagan than Christian. Even so, it seems likely that there are still enough genuine Christians around to make the hardline imposition of a pagan society difficult. Moreover, unlike the Christians of late antiquity, who could hardly have supposed that they had built the empire, modern Christians can suppose with some plausibility that they and their Christian forebears were responsible for the construction of the civilization that's now being wrested from them. It would be understandable if they were not inclined to passively acquiesce as modern paganism takes over the city they and their ancestors have constructed and attempts to relocate them to the shrinking space outside the city walls. Predictions are precarious, and it's possible that a hardline refusal to accommodate Christianity with respect to marriage, sexuality, employment, education, commercial activity, and other matters could succeed in more or less peacefully repressing the non-conforming constituencies. But it seems more likely, I think, that the uncompromising approach will merely raise to a new level of intensity the cultural conflicts we've been experiencing in recent decades. And so in the end, alas, it may be that the splendid pagan city, like the Christian one, is simply not to be realized in this world, or at least not by the application of law and force. But now let's change course, bracket whatever doubts we may have, and suppose that the modern pagan city could be realized, and that opposition from Christians and others could be subdued or contained, and that the city settles in to support the modern pagan way of life. Is this a city that you and I would want to make our home? It's a big and multifaceted question, but I want to focus on just one aspect of that question. How satisfying or how fulfilling would life be for citizens in the modern pagan city? Fulfilling. Now that's an elusive criterion, and hence an elusive question. It's one that I'm likely to maul, but it's also a crucial question, I believe, and so I hope you'll bear with me as I try to struggle with it for just a few moments. So what does it mean for life to be fulfilling? One way of posing the question is in terms of goods. In a Christian understanding, perhaps nowhere better expounded than in Augustine's Confessions, the world provides an array of goods: friendship, pleasure, sexual gratification, professional recognition, aesthetic experience, and these are genuine goods, but they're also transitory in two senses. In time, they grow stale and unsatisfying, and they end with death, our own death or the deaths of friends and loved ones. These goods are not stable ends in themselves, but rather glimpses of and pointers to a higher good, eternal life, or the life of and with God. Take away that transcendent reference in this world, in this earthly city, lose their purpose and become, as Augustine said, a kind of death in life, or life in death. Was Augustine right about this? Or are the goods of this world sufficient, or at least as good as it gets, and thus the only goods we should concern ourselves with? Another way to put the question is in terms of meaning. In the first lecture, I discussed the view of Viktor Frankl, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Leo Tolstoy, and others that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We're not content with flourishing in the sense of satisfying our interests, or even with living by a code of morality. Rather, we want to see our lives as having some sort of meaning. But what does meaning in this context mean? The very happily named philosopher John Wisdom proposed an analogy to a play. We can see part of a play, perhaps, missing the beginning or the end, and wonder how the part we saw fits within the whole play. Or we can see the whole play and wonder what it means. What is the character or point of the narrative? Is it a tragedy, a comedy, an exhibition of the absurd, or something else? In the former case, we're wondering about how the larger play would give sense to the fragment that we saw. In the latter case, we're wondering about what the philosopher called the order in the drama of time. Following Wisdom's suggestion, we might present our current question in this way. Each of us directly observes only an infinitesimally small slice of the human affairs of our own time, namely the ones we're personally involved in, but we can indirectly learn about some of the affairs of other human beings, still only a tiny fraction probably, both in our own times and at earlier stages in human history. And with respect to these various human doings, we can ask, does all of this human activity, our own and that of others, all of this living and striving and dying, have any meaning? Does it mean anything? As Viktor Frankl asked as he clung to life as a prisoner in the Nazi death camps, has all this suffering, this dying around us, a meaning? Does human existence fit into some sort of overarching plot or narrative? And if so, is that narrative one that plays out and makes sense within this world? Or do the human doings of this world seem more like an act or fragment of a larger narrative that will be completed and redeemed in some other dimension of existence, and without which our mundane doings are ultimately lacking in narrative sense. Sound and fury signifying nothing, as Shakespeare put it. Now, these questions generate a variety of answers, obviously. But the answers, I think, might be sorted into 4 logical categories, and I mentioned these actually in the first lecture in response to a question from the audience. It might be that neither individual lives nor human activity in history as a whole have meaning in the narrative sense. Or second, it might be that human history as a whole has no meaning, but individual lives do. Conversely, and third, history as a whole might possess some kind of narrative sense, but individual lives might not. Finally, it might be that both individual lives and human activity as a whole have some sort of narrative meaning. Now, perhaps the most familiar answer today, at least in elite circles, is the first one. There's neither any overall meaning in human history nor any objective meaning in individual lives. The more the universe seems comprehensible, physicist Steven Weinberg declares, the more it also seems pointless. Individuals likewise are born, they live, they experience pleasure and pain, happiness and disappointment, and then they die. They may, if they like, try to think of their lives under the form of some sort of story, of which they themselves are the putative authors. And that, I think, was the possibility that the questioner in the first lecture was asking me about, that he associated with Nietzsche. So that might be, that's something that some people can do. But from a detached perspective, there is no overall meaning or story in their existence. To Tolstoy's question, is there any meaning in my life that will not be annihilated by the inevitability of death that awaits me? The most plausible answer would be no, there isn't. As Bertrand Russell declared, no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. This is probably the view most congruent with secularism of the positivistic variety. Modern paganism, by contrast, appears to favor the second answer. An individual's life has meaning, the elderly Ronald Dworkin insisted, but it doesn't seem to follow that there is any overall meaning in human history or anything that contradicts Weinberg's more global or cosmic claim that it all seems pointless, none that Dworkin managed to articulate at least. The religion without God seems calculated not to supply any such overall meaning, but rather to offer the consolation that although there may be no overall point to it all, our individual lives can still have objective meaning, whatever that is. Measured against wisdom's suggested narrative or theater analogy, though, I think the contention that individual lives have meaning within the frame of this world seems wildly implausible, at least as any sort of general proposition. True, there are people whose lives may form a satisfying narrative pattern. They live through and savor the chapters of life, youth, adulthood, old age. They posit and achieve worthwhile goals, perhaps, enjoy many of the pleasures and achievements they set out to enjoy, or perhaps raise healthy and productive children who will remember them and carry on their legacy. Good for them, for the favorites of fortune, as Edward Gibbon put it. But then many other people's lives are deformed by deprivation or truncated by tragedy. They meander aimlessly through life, never even figuring out what they want from it. Or they have aspirations, but fail miserably to achieve them. Maybe they inflict immense and pointless harm on themselves and others, perhaps die prematurely, sometimes at their own hand, while their aspirations and potential remain unrealized. If a novelist or playwright abused, tortured, or killed off his characters in these arbitrary and senseless ways, we would rebel. That is not how a coherent story is supposed to go. But all too often, that is how actual human lives do unfold. The French philosopher Luc Ferry attempts valiantly to develop some notion of meaning within this life, transcendence within immanence, as he calls it, but he admits that the fact of death poses a serious obstacle to this enterprise. Of the various possible responses to the inevitability of death, Ferry says, I find the Christian proposition infinitely more tempting, except for the fact that I do not believe it. The skeptical or resigned response to these morose observations, of course, would be that human life simply don't have and don't need to have the kind of meaning that wisdom described and that Ferry seeks. That, again, was the answer of Bertrand Russell and of countless others. But if human lives do have meaning in the sense of a satisfying or fulfilling narrative, it surely is not realized here. Even the favorites of fortune, as Gibbon put it, die after a relatively brief span. Even if their legacy somehow lives on, they're not around to appreciate the fact. Then what's the good of glory, magnificent renown, Sophocles has the aged Oedipus ask, if in its flow it streams away to nothing? For individual people, it seems this world is not sufficient unto itself. A third possibility is that individual lives lack meaning in the narrative sense, but that human history as a whole is meaningful. Marx offered one version of this answer. Hegel offered another. History in its vast sweep is like a grand master's chess game that will culminate in some admirable victory, the classless society perhaps, or the final triumph of reason. Individuals, you and I, are merely the pawns who are moved about and unsentimentally sacrificed in the pursuit of that grand culmination. Or as Hegel put it, history is the slaughter bench at which the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have been victimized. But all is part of an overarching agenda in which reason, whatever that is, will ultimately be realized in this world. So, should we individuals, we pawns on the chessboard, or sacrificial victims at the slaughter bench of history, find consolation in the reflection that our own lives, while meaningless in themselves and perhaps miserable, are the ingredients for a larger historical story? Some people have no doubt found that thought comforting, all those who sacrificed themselves for the Marxist dream, for example. But should they have? Unlike the preceding answers, Christianity teaches that there is an overall meaning, and also that individual lives have their own meanings or meaningful narratives, meanings that fit into and fulfill the larger story. This is a teaching, though, that to some extent requires a leap of faith, and the teaching seems utterly implausible if we limit the framework to this world and this life. This world is not sufficient unto itself. Taken merely on its own terms, it doesn't add up to any discernible or satisfying narrative. As G.K. Chesterton's fictional priest detective Father Brown put it, we are here on the wrong side of the tapestry. The things that happen here do not seem to mean anything. They mean something somewhere else. And so Christianity expands the scope and looks to a transcendent frame and goal. In this respect, the theologian E.L. Maskell argued that, quote, the modern absurdists, like Sartre and Camus, are fully right in maintaining that the world does not make sense of itself. Maskell quoted Wittgenstein, the sense of the world must lie outside the world. All that happens in this case is accidental. What makes it non-accidental cannot lie within the world, since if it did, it would itself be accidental. It must lie outside the world. And Maskell summarized the alternatives. So we're presented with this choice. We may, if we so decide, make the best of a world in which is in the last resort a senseless and hostile desert, in which we must either bury our heads in the sands or make each for himself our little private oases. Or we may look for the world's meaning in some order of reality outside and beyond it, which can do for the world what the world cannot do for itself. My discussion in these lectures would suggest a slight revision of Maskell's description. Maskell supposed, as so many have, that the live alternative today to Christianity or to transcendent religion is something like the disenchanted scientific naturalist worldview that resonated with the resigned or heroic or mock-heroic declarations of people like Bertrand Russell and Walter Stace, and that we considered in the first lecture. But as we've seen, that sort of disenchanted worldview, though it may in some sense be the official orthodoxy of domains like contemporary academia, probably has a comparatively small constituency. Nearly everyone believes in something that is sacred and inviolable. And so in the political domain, the leading alternatives once again seem to be the city centered on the imminent religiosity of modern paganism, or the city that continues to accept Christianity, or at least transcendent religion, as an ideal. Although we can't know exactly what the pagan city would look like, I've tried in the last few minutes to reflect on that prospect. The pagan city, I think, would be one that accepts and asserts the existence of imminent sanctities, like human dignity, perhaps, or plant and animal species, but is self-consciously closed off against transcendence. The city would probably not actually prohibit belief in transcendence, but such a belief is foreign and an offensive element within the ethos of pagan civility, and so the city would accordingly try to marginalize transcendence and its committed devotees, to relocate them outside the ever-expanding walls that define the civic or public sphere. Forceful measures might be needed to achieve such closure and marginalization. I've questioned whether this sort of civic paganism is a viable basis for a community under current circumstances, and even if it is, whether the community that it contemplates is the sort of city we really want to live in. Would the pagan city allow us to be free and at home again in the world after centuries of alienation? Or would it entail a new and more repressive authoritarianism? And would it impoverish and degrade our communal existence, reducing that existence to the mundane pursuit of fugitive and ultimately futile goods and pleasures in a world understood to have no ultimate point or purpose, and relegating those with a different and more transcendent vision to a life of civic pariah subsisting outside the city walls. Eliot thought that something like the latter scenario was more likely. Many, of course, will take a different view, and they might ask, what is the alternative, the Christian alternative that Eliot preferred? I've said very little about that alternative, but that's because, as with the pagan city, we can't know exactly what the Christian city would look like, but in another sense, the Christian city is one we've known and inhabited already for centuries. So we know that Christianity is proven to be compatible with, and at the same time in tension with, a whole variety of political and cultural regimes. Christianity has persisted under monarchies, oligarchies, and democracies, in poverty and prosperity, in societies that were technologically backward or advanced. The common feature has been that Christian societies have embraced as an aspiration a transcendent ideal that they've known in advance will not be realized in this world. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. That's been a prayer, never a present reality. The transcendent ideal has been and surely would continue to be the source sometimes of intolerance toward those who don't accept the ideal, of criticism of the society for its ubiquitous failures to realize the ideal, and of progress as society attempts to respond to criticism and to move closer to the ideal. Hence, inquisitions and persecutions, but hence also campaigns for the abolition of slavery, discrimination, and poverty, and for religious freedom. And hence also a sort of perpetual restlessness, because in the Christian earthly city, the citizens are never and are not supposed to be fully at home. The human heart, as Augustine said, will be restless until it rests in its eternal abode. Unlike in some past instantiations, a central feature of any contemporary Christian society, I think, is that it's unlikely to sponsor any official account of what transcendence is and requires, any official orthodoxy. The modern Christian society would be open to transcendence, and it would attempt to accommodate its citizens in their efforts to live in accordance with their understandings of transcendence. It would not declare or prescribe what that transcendent truth is. In this openness, and in this ongoing struggle to grasp and approach a transcendent ideal that's not realizable in this world, the city would of necessity call upon the political skills and virtues, the creative efforts, the moral aspirations and imagination, the empathy, and the willingness to sacrifice of its citizens, which seems to be what Eliot contemplated. And this seems a fitting conclusion to our investigation of his thesis, when he observed that, quote, the only hopeful course for a society which would thrive and continue its creative activity in the arts of civilization is to become Christian. That prospect involves at least discipline, inconvenience, and discomfort. But here as hereafter, the alternative to hell is purgatory. Purgatory, of course, is a transitional state or place or condition, as is human life for pagans and Christians alike. The world is a fugitive state. Unlike the gods, and for better or worse, we mortals have here no abiding city. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith. So let me open it up to questions from the audience. We have microphones, so if you'll wait until the microphone comes to you, please. We'll start back here. Yes.
I want to thank you for your talk. It certainly is challenging, and to thank the Madison Society for always presenting challenging talks. I would like to put this into a slightly different perspective using what you saw as the 4th century issue and the development from the pagan city to the Christian city, and try and expand that a bit and move from the Christian city to the Holy Roman Empire, in which you had an expansion of this to most of Europe. And following from that, we see the Reformation. The Reformation being a first view as a series of heresies, and then for the final breakdown of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic dominance. And with that, we begin to see the separation of church and state. The Reformation creates various denominations, and they separate themselves from the state in many different ways. That's followed by the Enlightenment, which seems to then move us towards the true secular or pagan position. We then have the French Revolution, which is the epitome of Enlightenment destroying a Catholic nation. So the question that I have is, was a great deal of what you're talking about the result of the Reformation's creation and moving towards the Enlightenment? And does this reflect in other ways in the 20th century in terms of transcendent religions being a dominant force in a society? And the examples that I use may sound strange initially, but I think I would ask you to think carefully about this. The first is ISIL or ISIS, in which a transcendent religion has a view of a just society based upon the transcendence religion reading of their book, Creation of Sharia Law. And we're also going through a stage as you look at Israel in which the transcendent religion, and certainly in the current conservative government, is moving more and more towards the Torah as its law. So the question that I have is that, did the Reformation start this ballgame? And are the new traditionalists in places such as the United States, in the ISIL situation, and in Israel, looking to move back to the religious law as found in their primary books, be it the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the Quran? And what do you see as the impact of that kind of analogy?
Well, I get, okay. I appreciate it. Very good question, actually. I sometimes get criticized for like in a 250-page book covering everything from starting with the time of Jesus up to the present, but you managed to do it, I think, in in the course of a question, and I appreciate that. I think it's valuable to try and think in those long range terms. The last part of what you asked, I think, is I'm more confident answering that. I started this lecture by quoting Walker Percy, who says, that there's a sense of homelessness in the world today. I think that is an accurate observation, and there are probably various reasons for that, but I think one of them is surely the loss of the kind of accessible, more transcendent that Weber's talking about the disenchantment of the world, so it's pertinent to that sort of thing. That's I think widely appreciated, and so it's not surprising that it produces a kind of yearning for something, that would alleviate that sense of homelessness. I was talking today quite a bit about how I think modern paganism reflects that yearning, but that can be reflected in other ways, and the kind of traditionalists that you talk about, I think, are also trying to do that in a way that, I guess, I might ultimately have greater hope of some sort of, if it could be done, because I've indicated that I'm not sure that, that the pagan project really could ever do that. With respect to Islam, I might just refer you to, this is not something I study much, but what's the name of the novel? I forgot, Hollenbeck, or the French novelist who wrote a number of novels, but Submission is the name of the, that's a novel that's a very interesting novel, and it's exactly about that. And I think I read an interview with Hollenbeck, who's surely not Muslim, but said secularism just doesn't provide any sense of what people need, and if they can't get it anywhere else, they're going to turn to Islam for it. So some people do look to Islam. That's undoubtedly, I think, an explanation, a partial explanation for some of the power that Islam has. In fact, in that respect, I'll mention one other thing. So I sent, actually, just to get some comments, drafts about a month ago of these lectures to 2 or 3 friends of mine, asking for criticism. And one, who's Australian, someone says, now you understand that I'm an atheist, and I'm more along the lines of Bertrand Russell in my view. The quotes that I get from Bertrand Russell, he says, pretty much capture my view. He says, but I thought your lectures were interesting, and I think they really did illuminate a lot of the current situation that I hadn't thought about. And then he added, he says, the thing is though, he says, I see no prospect for any sort of Christian renewal of society, because whenever I get dragged to church, I don't see it in what I read about. I see no conviction anywhere. He says, when I look to the Islamic world, I at least see a lot of conviction or something like that. And so I'm not sure that, I mean, that's a simplification, and I don't think it's wholly fair and so forth, but it's one perception that's probably not unique to him. And so I think that is probably relevant to that part of the question. Now, what you started off by saying, did it all start with the Reformation? You may know Brad Gregory's book called The Unintended Reformation. And I saw one review of that book. It was a critical review that said, blame it all on the Reformation, or something like, blame it all on the Reformation. He certainly does show, I think, how the Reformation set in motion a number of developments that have led to some of the conditions that we might find unsatisfactory in the world today, and that would relate to some of the things I've been talking about. I'm not sure I'd say, though, that, whenever you say something like that, we say, well, what's the problem now? I say, well, it was the last generation, or the 60s got it started. They say, oh, but why did that happen? So, well, there was something in the earlier situation, that led to that, and you keep going back, and, one other thing led to this, but something before that led to this, and so forth. I was joking. I said jokingly, you might not have heard on the first day when Robbie said something like this. And I said, yeah, usually it gets traced back, I think, to the nominalism of the 14th century. That's where things went wrong. So, but, is that where things really went wrong? Once you get into those sort of things, well, one thing in history leads to another, and some of it's at least a sort of understandable or predictable response to what came before and so forth. So I guess I myself the Reformation is certainly a convenient spot to look for where a lot of things became visible and got set in motion that have led to the condition that we have now. But maybe that's just another, that's just part of a historical process as well. I asked Robbie at dinner the other day, I said, well, but I seem to remain, I myself am not Catholic, so I said, I seem to recall reading in John Paul II's Crossing the Threshold of Pope that he may have said the Reformation was necessary, though. And he says, I think he did say that. Who knows? That's a very interesting kind of question.
I want to thank the questioner for his question. If I may speak to that question and then to you about it. You seem to have developed a bifurcation. I don't know whether you meant it or I'm not understanding it, between the pagan who wants to be at home, but the material world doesn't give him the basic stuff to be at home, and the Christian who understands that this is not his home. Both of which ultimately reject, impliedly, which I don't know whether you meant to imply this, the goodness of what this world is. But if you look at Jewish Christian revelation, the insistence on the goodness of this world compared to the pagan alternatives is absolutely front and center. One of the reasons has been posited why the Jews were not in the revelation they received pointing to the other world was so that they would understand that life here in and of itself is good. They weren't on the carcass of a dead God. God had created something that was good. And so Christianity, in my view, has always been pointed. Now, some people claim the Reformation with the corruption, the insistence on the corruption of man turned that away. But Christianity, in the main, has always been pointing to the goodness of God's creation in this world. The example that was given that, say, ISIS is pointing to a transcendent truth, I think is exactly the opposite. ISIS is a nihilistic apprehension, a nihilistic application of a this worldly belief. They are attempting to change everything in this world so that this world becomes a home to the Muslim. They're not thinking about anything transcendent whatsoever. They reject almost anything that is spiritual, Sufi, or others in the Muslim tradition. One other example. I believe that one of the greatest events in Catholic history was the loss of the Papal States, because Caesaropapism is always the temptation of attempting to make your transcendent reality in the world substantial and material. Well, look what happened to the Catholic Church after they lost the Papal States. It broke out. From Pope Leo on, it had more influence of being in the world but not of the world. So my argument to you, and you can show how I am wrong, is that you have impliedly suggested that the Christians are otherworldly and not this worldly, and the pagans are this worldly. I think the Christians are both. I think the Jewish and the Christian tradition have seen the value in the relationship that heaven and earth kiss after the resurrection, that they're not opposites, but are two parts of the same whole.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Hopefully it'll allow me to say something that I hope will clarify something that I may have left confused, at least in my own thinking. But I won't say anything about your comment about the Papal States. I'll accept what you say about that. And I'm not going to say anything about ISIS either. I don't know enough to comment knowledgeably on that. But the central question that you asked and that you began with, I think, is what would be a good way to put this? I think it would be fair to say that for classical paganism, whatever good we have is in this world. You know, this is the place where we're going to have whatever good we have. Death is a bleak state of affairs for the most part. Most depictions, you know, when Odysseus runs into Achilles when he goes down to the underworld and he says, well, at least you seem to be, a ruler down here. Achilles, I'd rather be a slave of a farmer or something, on earth than to be a ruler in hell. So whatever good we have is in this life. Now, the Christian response to that, my understanding would be, of course it's complicated. Not everybody thinks in a single simple way and so forth. But it seems to me the basic response is, as you say, not that this world is a bad thing, or not a good thing. Some people take that view and they're condemned as heretics, right? That view comes to be viewed as heresy. This world is a good thing. Just reading, say, book of 1 John or something, you might well get the idea anybody who's a friend of the world, is at war with God. You can read certain things, and surely there were people who developed that sort of view, but that, I take it, was not the dominant Christian view. So I agree with you, I think, this life is a good thing. But nonetheless, it's a lesser good thing, and it's good because it's part of a larger eternal structure, and without that, it wouldn't be a good thing, I think. And I think Augustine makes that really clear. The goods of this life are goods, but they're goods partly because they're derivative of and they're part of a larger good, and without that, they wouldn't be good. They'd be, again, death and life or life and death and so forth. So it's entirely possible, I think you take this view, and I probably would too, to say that the Christian view actually makes this life more good, you might say, than the pagan view does. But nonetheless, it's good in a sort of a more derivative or subordinate sense and so forth. I think that's, so I hope that's, I don't think I'm disagreeing with you. I think I agree with you on that, and I do think I may have not made that at all clear. So hopefully that answer to your question will clarify that a little bit. Okay, so.
Thank you so much. Another great lecture. And just to ping pong around a little bit, I'll pick up from the last question in this sense that, and I clearly see that distinction was drawn between the gang of criminals called ISIL versus the Sufi and the other traditions of Islam. Mm-hmm. And the distinction being made to make it a little bit more clear that just because there's a gang of criminals who are getting supported by some funding from somewhere doesn't mean they represent Islam or Muslims in the billions and billions of them in certain ways.
I was at a conference, I'll just say, about a year ago in Milan with one of the participants was a Muslim scholar from Singapore, actually. But I just mentioned it to him, and he says, I hate those people. They're not, so I certainly agree. I don't want to take them as reflective of.
But to get to the question, what I want to focus on is you're drawing a very clear line distinction, binary again in previous words, that you're drawing distinction between Christianity and paganism. And when I hear you, I see the Christianity that the way you're expressing is largely in terms of American exceptionalism. And by American exceptionalism, I really mean in the sense of the immigrant culture. These are the people who actually ran from persecution, religious persecution and other political persecution, and made this place home. And therefore, the continuing cycle of accepting not tolerating, accepting the immigrant culture and accepting the values of the immigrant culture. So in that sense, I want to kind of draw the distinction between the European Christianity or their view of not accepting the immigrants versus the American exceptionalism of accepting the immigrants and making everybody comfortable about what they are experiencing. So in that context, where I want to go, taking the American Christianity as experience, where I want to go is, if I have understood correctly, and tell me if I am wrong, if I got it wrong, is that if somebody is Christian, but also thinks it's okay to have, and I'm going back to yesterday's lecture, it's okay to have contraception available. It's okay to have at least unions in my mind of same-sex individuals, if not, which has now been termed legally as marriage, but at least it's a union. And so all those little things that you had drawn yesterday, so if somebody is believing in transcendent God, or somebody is a Christian, but yet wants to have that acceptance of those values, contraception, etc., the list of things you had, does that make that person paganistic? Is that person pushing for a pagan society? Is that pagan city becoming? I'm getting confused in that binary conversation that has taken place. So I just want a clarity on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Now that's well, one thing I'll say to start off with is, at least as it stands now, the overall book project has 12 chapters. But for purposes of this lecture, I tried to compress the first 8 chapters into the first lecture. And I think 3 chapters or something into the second one. And this one was basically just a summary of the last one. So the fact that I talk more about American experiences, partly because it's true in those chapters I'm talking about current American cultural controversies and so forth, and so that might create a misimpression of what I'm trying to do overall. Overall, I don't think that's right. I have a lot more actually on ancient Christianity and so forth than I do on the modern. But the harder question you're asking, and I think that you're asking very earnestly, is this one. I know people who in complete good faith consider themselves Christians can take a whole range of views on a whole lot of different issues. First of all, I'm obviously not in a position to judge anybody, how sincere they are in their Christian faith and so forth, and I know they can take a whole range of positions on a whole range of different issues. I'm actually Mormon, and so I'm sort of sensitive to efforts to define Christianity too narrowly to exclude people and so forth, and I don't want to do that myself either. So I don't want to get into those kinds of judgments too much in this sort of project. On the other hand, I do think it's kind of necessary to be able to make some claims and interpretations based on whether particular positions resonate more with traditional Christianity, Christian views and Christian values, or do not. So with respect to religious freedom, which is one of the issues I talked about yesterday, I think it is actually quite demonstrable that an American commitment to accommodating religion, for example, by giving exemptions, one form often has been to give exemptions to people, if possible, if the application of a general law would burden their exercise of their religion. I think it's demonstrable that that is traceable to a sort of a Christian heritage, to authorities, God and Caesar, etc. I think that's demonstrably true. I think that when you no longer accept that as any sort of ideal for your community, the reasons for accommodating a religion in that way are much weaker, or they tend to disappear. I think what we see in the world today is, in the academy and in public generally, is a great erosion of commitment to that traditional American commitment to accommodating a religion, to understanding religious freedom in that way. And I think that can be linked to the movement away from a Christian conception of community to something else. It doesn't mean, I think, that anybody who isn't enthusiastic about free exercise exemptions then is necessarily not a Christian, or can't be a Christian. I have friends who I have no doubt are Christians who don't agree with me on some of those issues. I don't think they're not Christians because they disagree with me on some of those issues, but I do think their view is resonating more with the more imminent view and not with the Christian view. I think I can say that. And I think that similar things could be said about some of the other things that you mentioned, marriage, for example. I think that can be said. I understand. Someone pointed out to me, a seminary student pointed out to me after the lecture yesterday. He says, well, there's a great deal of work being done today about understanding whether the scripture really supports, some of what I was describing as traditional Christian views of sexual morality and so forth. And I know that's true, and I don't really want to be in a position of saying it. All the people, again, I have friends who I think are Christian who come out differently than I do on that issue, but I think it is still very plausible to say their views on this issue seem to have been heavily influenced by an ethos that is not really grounded so much in a Christian worldview as in something else. Maybe Christianity can accommodate that. Maybe it can even support that. But I think taken as a whole, it reflects a movement away from a Christian conception of community to something different. I hope I can say that much without judging any individual person and saying, by taking this position, you're not Christian. I don't want to do that. I hope that's at least partly responsive to what you were asking. So.
So I really liked the references to Percy. I'm stronger on him than T.S. Eliot. And the intuition I have from thinking about Percy for a long time is that he'd say the problem of a entirely pagan city like this, which he tries to extrapolate out in his novels and things like that, is that the goods it offers aren't enough, and people turn to things, to other sort of gods of violence, of sort of re-enchantment and things like that, which I think ISIL was one of them. It's this sort of entirely this worldly oriented monstrosity. Is that what you're trying to argue about, what the ultimate failure of the pagan city is? Is it that sort of Rawls's grandchildren are going to go mad with ideology and violence?
Well, I think, that's maybe a succinct way of putting one of the themes I was sort of talking about today. The pagan city, if that's what we're moving into or have now, can look really attractive. There's, as I talked about in an earlier lecture, there's been throughout Western history, I think, this yearning to get back to, once again, the merry dance of paganism, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. If we could reestablish that, we'd be at home in the world again. There's all kinds of attractiveness to it. One of the counters, I think, is the one that you just said. Would the goods really of the pagan city really be the goods that would make this the home that we would want to live in? And you mentioned Percy, but in a number of ways, I think there's reason to be skeptical about that. So I think that is one of the themes.
I mean, even in science fiction, though, no one can imagine a future perfect sort of pagan world where the author can't have these protagonists that go off and have to do exciting, violent things to sort of get them out of their fix.
Right. I mean, or if we could come to terms with it, that's almost more depressing. Some sort of situation. No, we can sort of maybe, dumb down and despiritualize human nature to the point where we're happy enough with just, a little sort of fairly consumerist society, and we don't need anything else. If we could do that, as I say, that's even more depressing, I think, than than the idea that we wouldn't be able to accommodate ourselves and we'd be moving the Bible. So, yeah. So.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that I missed your lecture yesterday, but anyway, because I think religious freedom is a key part of this modern pagan society, which gives me hope that if as long as I don't see us as the baker and the florist or whatever you talked about, it's good that this is being debated back and forth. And I think if justice comes about, usually they're accommodated, and I think that's tending to happen. So I don't see them as pariahs outside the city. I mean, I think they've been kept in. And if we go back to history, it was even in Athanasius, he who had to rail against the heresies, but he always talked about the fact that God was not concerned with it. The problem is creation is good. Mm-hmm. But he wanted you to think about the Creator. And that's why Jesus, comes about and shows us how to live a human life that God would be pleased with. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that's kind of a different thing. And it's unfortunate that those authors often get skipped around. But then again, when you talk about, the marvels of you take the best Christian monarchy that sort of existed. Well, if you take St. Louis IX, the problem with his reign in the 13th century, it looks wonderful. I mean, he takes the religious orders, the Franciscans, going out and asking peasants and, making sure that their grievances are set up and so on and so forth. But Jews were persecuted. Mm-hmm. It's a fact. And I think what is happening now is actually good, because I think Christianity and the gospel actually wants you to be accepting of other faiths. It's tolerance. Mm-hmm. And if they're converted to your faith, well, that's good. If not, you brush the dust off your feet and you go on, but you don't persecute them. And I think that's the basic problem. So Jews, Islamic, as I said, the Sufis actually, as the previous commentator came out, they also believe in not just the transcendent world, but the goodness of this world, and they appreciate that, and that we, should praise that, because in praising that, you're praising the Creator, mm-hmm. and so everybody agrees on that. And so I have a little bit more hope, and I think these pagan atheists that you talk about, and I talk to atheists, and it's always a problem. I think what's going to happen is one of the wonderful things is that science and Christianity are compatible, and I guess Alvin Plantinga wrote a beautiful book about this, and just steadily demolishes the new atheists, mm-hmm. and points out how science, and I agree with all of his, scientific issues. He's taken the trouble to understand them, and it's compatible with Christianity. And if this could be correctly, as we said, most people can often be uneducated about their own faith, and if we could bring this out in the public sphere so that Christianity is not, and the deepness of it is not something that you don't want to learn, or science becomes too difficult to learn, but you still go with your bandwagon, science, it would be much better. Mm-hmm. we can, I think, be optimistic about what will happen.
But thanks.
Tolerance is a really important part of it.
Yeah. I agree with a whole lot of what you said, maybe most of it, and you said it very well, I think. There are a couple reservations, though, I might have. One fairly specific one. I don't see at the moment, hopefully in the longer run you may be right, but at the moment I don't see things combining to accommodate the florist, the baker, and so forth. As I said, they've been losing every case I don't think they've won any, people in that position have not won any cases so far. And my sense is that most people in the academy are not sympathetic to them, that a lot of people are not. So I hope you're right about that, but I don't see that happening at the moment.
Hobby Lobby won, and the Little Sisters of the Poor, I think that are going to be winning.
Well, okay, that's a good corrective to what I said, right. There have been some of in the application of anti-discrimination laws, I think the religious objectors have not won any of those. But, but in some other contexts they have won, and also I've been, teaching in this area and writing in it within the academy for, I hate to say it, but, over 30 years now, and I would say within the academy, the trend has really been the other way, towards rejecting the idea that there should be any special accommodation or treatment of religion. I think it's really been the other way, and I fear that often what happens in the academy is just sort of an omen of what's going to happen more generally a short time later. So I'm a little bit worried about that, I have to say. But I tend to agree with you about religious freedom, though, being something that a true understanding of Christianity does support. I tend to agree with that. I guess I ask more questions to myself about that than maybe I should, or than some people do. I mean, a person I admire tremendously is Thomas More, St. Thomas More. His views on this, I think, were rather different than the ones that would prevail today. And I'm pretty reluctant often to just say, well, he was 5 centuries ago and he probably didn't understand what we understand and so forth. So to me, there are more complicated questions that leave me a little bit more irresolute about that. But in general, I think I agree with you on that. And I have to say just personally, I want a society in which the sort of embrace religious freedom, toleration, and a great diversity of religion flourishes. I like that. Thomas More probably wouldn't have agreed on that, I think, but maybe I've been raised that way, and that's the kind of society I like, and I think that's consistent with Christian commitments.
To move away from the specific implications and effects for a moment, can you describe what it is you see as becoming imminent in the pagan state? I mean, the center of your argument is that there is something that's become imminent inside the pagan state. What exactly is that?
Well, it might be that the lecture from yesterday, and I think you were here yesterday too, I think, might be more responsive to that, because I talked about 3 areas, I think, yesterday in which I think the trend has been towards what I would describe as a more imminent sort of view in the area of public symbols, in the area of sexual norms as they're embodied in law, and once again in the area of religious freedom.
But do you see something behind that?
Yeah, I see something behind it. I mean, if you just go back to, I think I mentioned yesterday, what sort of got me started on this project in the first place. So the Indiana religious, just take that as an example. Indiana proposes a religious freedom bill that's almost word for word identical to the one that in 1993 President Clinton praised effusively and Congress passed almost unanimously. As we know, there was a huge public reaction to that, and the sports world, the corporate world, the university world were strongly against that. Now, the opposition, I think, is very difficult to understand and describe just in terms of some kind of positivistic, utilitarian type secular rationality. There is I think, a religious zeal behind that needs to be understood, I think. One of the incidents that got a lot of attention was when this owner of a pizza parlor, Memory Pizza, says, I wouldn't cater a same-sex wedding. And the opposition was tremendous, although there was also quite a lot of support. People donated a lot of money and so, to support the pizza owner. But in a different kind of world, one that would fit more the standard descriptions of secular versus religious, I think people might say it's one pizza business that evidently never actually had catered weddings anyway. And so it's one pizza business, and at least just watching TV, I don't have the sense that there's any shortage of pizza suppliers. It seems like, you can hardly watch TV for an hour without seeing several ads. So in a different kind of world, you can imagine the response would be, what's the big deal? One guy says he won't do, he doesn't do it anyway, but he wouldn't do a pizza. That was not the reaction, of course. It was overwhelming opposition to that. It was clear, I think, that this was viewed as some sort of wickedness that needed to be stamped out, that could not be tolerated.
So it's really not the hollowing out of religious impulse. It's the importing of religious impulse and zeal into the realm of the state.
Yeah, from an imminent direction, I think. Yeah, that's what I would say. And I think you see that in lots of debates and so forth. The sort of demonizing rhetoric I talked about would just be another example of that. I think that's so common demonizing rhetoric on all sides of everything. There's a zeal on all sides of these issues and so forth that I think that's kind of the idea. The whole project, in a sense, is to try to give a long sort of global account of that, saying that's not just the kind of worldly secularism that we often say, has replaced Christianity. It's something different than that, I think. So, yeah.
We'll take one more question, Jenna.
Okay. All right, so I appreciate your attempt to discern the character of this nascent religion and kind of pull together different strands. I'm trying to work with some of the things I heard in the first lecture and this lecture on that. And I had asked before, both times, in both the first and the third lecture, your third option, the contemporary pagan option, seems to me to be different than the first and second options, ancient paganism and Christianity. Mm-hmm. And in the first lecture, it seemed to me that both the ancient pagan and the Christian options viewed man as somehow made in the image of God or gods, but different gods, and emphasizing different parts of what's divine in the human. And the third option didn't really, you didn't characterize it that way. And it seemed to me it needed something like that, needed to have some kind of aspirational or some sense of why a human being would desire to imagine this this other world. In this lecture, what comes out to me is that the third option always seems to work within some kind of vaguely frustrating constraints. So we're always trying to do X without Y. For example, Luc Ferry says, how can we have meaning without transcendence? And Dwork in the first lecture says, how can we have constraints on our action without some kind of divinely justified morality? In other words, it seems there's something, you said artificial, it seems something kind of artificial about it. We're working out some kind of position on paper about what we want our religion to look like. And I guess I'm not sure which to think. I have two questions about that, and I'm not sure which is the appropriate question. One is that something distinctive about this third option? And if so, what does it say about that option? My other question would be, does that mean that this option is not really a religion in the sense that the other two options are? Is it appropriate to consider it on the same plane or as a like sort of phenomenon as the first two options?
Well, let's see. See if I hope that. But I might not have been talking in quite the same way or intended this in quite the same way. So I think in the first lecture was trying to describe three sort of general, these are broad brush things, but sort of orientations or existential orientations. One would be paganism, the imminent religiosity. One would be transcendent religiosity, reflected in Christianity, for example, and later Judaism. And the third was actually positivistic secularism. So that was the third option I was trying to describe. That was the one that I think is, for many people, like their official version today. It's just, it's nothing, as Stay said, but matter in motion. It's happened, the particles have combined into a way that they produce sort of interesting, complicated creatures like us. We live for a while, we die, that's it. There's really nothing, it's sort of ontologically egalitarian. There's nothing sacred, everything is just the same. It's just, there are more complex arrangements of it and so forth that have evolved. And my argument has been, yeah, that's a possibility, and it's one that in some contexts people try to operate within. For example, when we were talking yesterday with one questioner about authority today, I said, I think theorists of authority today are somewhat constrained because they're academic theorists and they have to talk within the sort of assumptions of positivistic secularism, and they can't get, I think, very good answers within that. But that was my third option. And I say modern paganism is a version of the immanent orientation. And so it is kind of a direct descendant of, or just let's say a different manifestation of the same orientation as in ancient paganism. Now, I'm not sure. So when you said the third option is that we need to theorize in that, I'm not sure I quite got what, because my third option is the positivistic secularism, but I think I'm saying isn't being found by many, like Dworkin and others, to be satisfactory.
I meant the third option to characterize working, because I thought that.
Oh,
I
okay.
guess what the third option was a kind of, I thought you
Oh.
were kind of bridge option. You had like favor or something like this, right? That's the point.
Yeah, okay.
And that's that.
So the question would be more something like, do we need to have a good sort of description of, or almost like theology of, and theology wouldn't be the right word, I guess, of the modern paganism, something like that, maybe. I'll refer again to, at the moment, the one I know of that's the most really earnest attempt to supply it is, again, Anthony Cronman's huge book, 1,100 pages long, and it's a serious effort. I think, it's worthy of study, I think, and so forth. But Dworkin's is a much shorter, he really only has about, 50 pages or something on this particular aspect of, of his lecture. So his is much shorter. It doesn't purport to be any sort of full-blown version. I would say, the people who are in this vein nearly always, in my experience lately, point to Spinoza as sort of the source of their thinking. So there you could, get another worked out version of things. But probably this is ancient paganism didn't, it came in all kinds of diverse forms, and the term pagan was just a loose label, that was devised later in a sense to include all of it, and that would be true today too. So I guess I'd say, within human dignity thinkers or environmental thinkers or one thing or another, you're going to get all kinds of worked out versions of this or that version. So I'm kind of lumping them together, some of them under the heading of modern paganism. There's not going to be, I assume, any magisterium who's going to pull them all together and say, and the real meaning of modern paganism is this. I'm not sure if that's what you were asking, though, but I'm,
the contrast between that, if you're going to say you have 4 versions of religion, and the contrast between the first 3 and the last one.
right.
With you.
The contrast between the ancient paganism, where you said that men view themselves as divine by sort of having a kind of life force, which they expressed in the sexual orgies, and right? And then the second, Christians have a different understanding of what man is to be like God. And even Weber had an understanding of what it was, an a godlike view of a human being, kind of vaguely Nietzschean, that could look at the meaninglessness of the world and survive, right? So I was wondering if you could elaborate what the very compelling sort of elevated view of human life, if it's quasi-godlikeness, would be of this 4th option, I guess, the contemporary paganism.
Right, the contemporary paganism. Well, I'm skeptical whether, I guess I think someone like Cronman is going to, he purports to say, Christianity was deficient in all sorts of ways, he says, but it gave us some good things, including valuing individual human life and dignity and so forth. And ancient paganism didn't give us that. And so we need to retain that while getting rid of the bad things, that Christianity gave, or the defective things and so forth. And he thinks we can do it with Spinoza and, and development. Walt Whitman, for example, as he says, the contemporary, a good, contemporary poetic explanation of this, expression, I should say, probably not an explanation, but an expression of this. I myself, in the end, I guess I should just confess, I don't think it's really possible. I think it is possible on Judeo-Christian assumptions and probably not otherwise. That's just my own. So I think, you'll see lots of efforts to do it, but I don't know whether I think any of them will succeed. But I think, someone like Cronman's is an ambitious attempt to do it, and maybe it does. I mentioned I haven't even finished this book, so it would be rash of me to say that it doesn't succeed. No.
Well, you probably have sold as many copies of Cronman's book as your own.
Yeah, since mine isn't even available. But.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Well, it's been a wonderful 3 days. We worked Steve Smith very hard, and I think he's come through for us beautifully. And Steve, we thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.